Welcome, everyone, wherever you may be and whatever time zone you may be in. I'm Lance J. Brown, co-founder of the CSU. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, this year's first in our long-standing series of discussions with leaders around the world on our progress towards greater, greener cities for all. I'm speaking to you from New York City with our guest today, Yasemin Kologlu, and it's my pleasure to introduce her and to moderate the program. For those attending who want to see AIA continuing education credits, you'll receive one HSW, but must stay for the 45 minutes. Please use the learning objectives attached in the AIA self-reporting option. For those joining us for the first time, the organizer of this series, the CSU, is devoted to building bridges between the United Nations and civil society, the design professions, business, academia, and allied organizations. The CSU mission ranges from increasing awareness about emerging issues, facilitating knowledge transfer between and among policy and decision makers, and fostering connections, cooperation, and collaboration, all while at the same time promoting the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 11. In the spirit of collaboration, we want to thank all of today's program partners, all noted on the invitation. I want to invite everyone to visit our CSU website, see our resources, our publications, and join us for our upcoming 2024 events. Today's Green City speaker, Yasemin Kologlu, is a recognized leader in sustainable design and architecture. She's a principal of the venerable office of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, SOM, and plays a central role in transforming the building industry's response to the climate crisis, most notably through her work such as Urban Sequoia, a proposal for carbon sequestering built environments. She's the founder and leader of SOM's Global Climate Action Group, which led the firm to achieve carbon neutral operations in 2022. She leads the firm's climate action reports. She co-chairs the American Institute of Architects New York Chapter Committee on the Environment, is a co-founder and steering committee member of MEP 2040, an alignment of 3 complementary commitments by architects, structural engineers, and MEP system engineers, as well as manufacturers, who work together to dramatically reduce the lifetime carbon footprint of buildings. Yasemin serves on the Carbon Leadership Forum New York Steering Committee, regularly contributes to shaping carbon and sustainability policies with governments and professional organizations. She received her professional degrees from Cornell University and the London Metropolitan University. To date, the CSU has offered over 20 Green Cities programs. Most of these have focused on the best practices in a particular city around the world. All of these are available on our website. But today's program is a special event. As most know, every year at a COP, short for a Conference of Parties, United Nations Climate Change Conference, delegates from all walks of life come together with one goal in mind: reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and addressing climate change, the biggest challenge of our time. This year, over 95,000 delegates, by far a record number, from all over the world, came together in Dubai to make a difference for our future, our ever debatable future. Issues delved into fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas concentrations, global temperature loss and damage, the issue of small island states, among others. Yasemin represented the voice of architects and planners and building professionals as part of the Architecture 2030 official delegation in the climate negotiations. Architecture 2030 was founded by Ed Masria, a former honoree of CSU. There's a plethora of post-COP reports available: Architecture 2030, the World Resources Institute, the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, et cetera, et cetera. You can read them, but today we get the crux from Yasemin, who was actually there on the ground and participated. On a more personal note, I met Yasemin at an event that unpacked 2 events: the UN Habitat Second Assembly in Nairobi last June and the UIA World Congress held in Copenhagen last July. Under the auspices of the CSU and the United Nations World Urban Campaign, 25 experts met in New York to brainstorm in a session entitled UN Sustainable Developments Roundtable from Copenhagen to New York. Yasemin was generous enough to join us. Suffice it to say, it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And now, today, we're privileged to have her share her knowledge and thoughts following COP28. Yasemin is a CSU board member, and I am thrilled to announce that she is the 2025 CSU president-elect. I know you'll have many questions. I certainly do. Please use the chat function to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer them all. Yasemin, the screen is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Lance. Wow, that sounded amazing. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that today we can treat this as a small group conversation. So I'm going to try to present what I took away from COP, what the officials agreed at COP, and also what personally my predictions and insights are coming out of the event, and what are some of the things that I observed as well. So let me share my screen, and thank you very much for joining us today. And please make sure to write your questions, comments in the chat, and we'll come back to them as Lance mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's see. Are you seeing my screen by any chance?
We do.
Perfect. All right, let's get started. Okay, so this year COP28 was in Dubai, UAE, and it was in beginning of December. And what was really interesting about this COP is before even I went there, there was a lot of controversy around it. And particularly it was because the president selected for COP28 was actually coming from the oil industry. And secondly, there was a lot of maybe questions about, is this going to be effective? Is there anything going to come out of this event? Is it even worth attending? Were some of the questions that, I was hearing in my circles. And interestingly, I think there were a lot of skeptics, but also there are some results that came out of this that I will touch on today. And what was amazing in this event was it was the largest COP ever. From an attendance point of view, the delegates, there were about 95,000 people attending, and compared to previous years, it was a huge increase. But also, it was also visible on the ground that the focus was interesting. There was many topics people were discussing, and it was not a singular point of view, and it was a very diverse group of people that maybe was helpful to enlarge that group of participation as well. And firstly, coming out of it, it was, I'm going to talk about the 5 parts in this presentation. So the first, global stocktake agreement. So what came out of this COP? What's actually officially written that the nations agreed? Then I'm going to talk about an initiative introduced at COP, the Building Breakthrough. Then secondary takeaways that I saw, and some of my insights and predictions. And finally, I'll finish with the 5th Industrial Revolution. And this was a presentation, a short version of a presentation I gave also at COP, talking about how the 5th Industrial Revolution that we're living through right now could be a good opportunity for the built environment to re-examine, challenge, and change some of the way we do things as professionals in this industry. So it started as the first day, we're getting our batches, and there's, long queues. I waited in the queue for about 2 hours. And during this time, at the end of this day, actually, it was interesting that there was the first outcome. So it was announced at the end of first day that they were actually finalizing the operational agreements in terms of making the loss and damage fund, and how this could be actually addressed. And for those of us who might not be familiar, Loss and Damage Fund was introduced 2 years ago, and addressing the loss and damage to assist particularly vulnerable countries, developing countries who might not have the economic strength to deal maybe some of the adverse effects of climate change. So this fund could help those nations. And also what was interesting was that it's covering economic and non-economic loss and damage as well. So the built environment obviously is part of this fund. And it will include things like extreme weather events and any adverse effects of the climate change, such as seawater rises, floods, and others as well. And what was agreed at COP was operationalization of the fund. So while the fund was agreed previously, there was not quite clear agreement and guidelines on how this might be accessed or provided or actually funded. And this was a big win for our planet in a way. And during that day, there were already 700 million committed by nations, and they were talking about how this was going to be, what was the distribution mechanism and decision mechanism was going to be. So first day, quite a strong start, and we were all hoping that may the rest of it be like this. And at the end, there was quite interesting takeaways and quite interesting agreements made. And many of them are focusing around transitioning away from fossil fuels and also maybe phasing out the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And this is particularly important for the United States as well. And new technologies that might come in as part of this transition and how one can secure a just transition was part of the conversation. So the actual language in the commitments, the written commitments, are focusing. These are not the actual words from the document. They're much longer, but I just wanted to pull out a few of these to discuss in today's conversation. So a big win was, I think, transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems and to achieve net zero by 2050. And this is important because, I was part of as Lance mentioned, I was part of the Architecture 2030 delegation. And you can imagine at the end of each day, we were coming back together to actually assess the situation, share thoughts, and see how we can broaden our impact. And, as part of this delegation and many others who joined us, there was a lot of differences of opinions on this because some of us felt that the language could have been much stronger. And while it suggests to transition away from fossil fuels, the language is not as strong as it should be. And I'm actually in the camp where, yes, the language could have been stronger, but I think we need to recognize this moment as a moment of transition and of influence and a significant impact in our history, where all nations at COP agreed that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. So this is the first time it's officially agreed and accepted. So I see that as a win. The other one was phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. Some of you might know in the United States, actually, many industries are actually benefiting from subsidized fossil fuels. And I think they made actually quite a clear distinction here that they're not talking about subsidies that might benefit communities, that might address energy poverty. I think we're talking about those that are not in this category, which is interesting. And as part of this transition, they're highlighting that these nations have committed to tripling renewable energy by 2030, and particular focus on phasing down of coal power. And some of the nations around the globe are actually their primary source of energy remains to be coal, which is one of the worst fossil fuels in the world, actually. And then recognizing that to do this transition equitably, we cannot just look at the existing technologies and what we're using widely today, but we must also consider, of course, renewables, but also things like carbon removal and storage and utilization and low carbon hydrogen technologies. So there was a recognition that these technologies might have a role to play in this transition too. And the focus was also not just on carbon, but also on methane too. And some of us might know on this in this webinar that methane's impact is greater than carbon's impact in our planet. However, the quantity we're emitting is lesser. So something that was identified as an important gas, and we need to accelerate potential huge reductions on this topic. And then finally, the transitional fuels can play a big role here. And this is another one that was controversial in my circles, at least, because what the statement means actually, for example, in the transition period, before we can get new technologies or improve the ones that we have to fully transition to net zero, we might be able to use actually fossil fuels that have a lesser impact than other fossil fuels, such as, for example, gas might have a lesser impact, natural gas might have a lesser impact than coal. So we might stop using coal and use natural gas in the interim period. So all, what was great here is that I think the delegates the negotiators were not only focusing on the end goal or where we are today, but also carefully thinking about what are the potential stopgaps, potential intermediary solutions that might come in this process. And after that, it was interesting that there was the Building Breakthrough came. So Building Breakthrough is an initiative that was launched by, that was actually organized by Morocco and French governments and lobbied heavily during the event. And 28 nations agreed, signed up to the Building Breakthrough. And Building Breakthrough basically recognizes that as the built environment, we have a really big role to play in this transition. One is we impact people's lives. Two is we're one of the largest emitters in the globe. And three is we can actually, we might have a great impact for the future. So what they agreed to do as part of this transition this evolution we're trying to create, they agreed that they will actually prioritize, coordinate amongst themselves, share platforms and knowledge among countries towards decarbonization of the built environment, which I thought was fantastic because in my daily practice, for example, I look at the definition of net zero building in different contexts, and there's not that central definition, for example. Or I look at what does it take to get there, and the strategies in different countries are identified as different, or what might be accepted in this as well. So hopefully this kind of initiative helps to streamline what that means. So you see the proud nations here and the organizers of the commitment. And what's great is that you'll see some really big nations such as the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, and you also see others who might not have such a huge impact, or maybe they might not share the same financial, economic strength as well. And I thought that was a great balance to have in this collaboration, so everybody's voice is heard. And also you see that there's a diversity of geographies here. It's not predominantly from one continent. So I thought that could be a really wonderful opportunity for all of our nations to learn what works in the building industry and what doesn't, and do more of what works, basically. And as part of this agenda, the statement on top here, I think, is really critical. We governments gather under the Building Breakthrough will collectively act to facilitate worldwide near zero emission and resilient buildings are the new normal by 2030. I thought that was such a strong statement to say that they will be the new normal by 2030, and these countries are committing to basically accelerate and share information knowledge in this. And the way that it's outlined, how in my work, basically there is what they call the mapping, reporting, priority action, and country action steps. And as part of this, they're also trying to close the loop. So mapping in terms of looking at international collaboration initiatives and activities in the building sector. Then strategic review of priorities and what transition might look like. Identifying opportunities and collaboration opportunities as well. And then in terms of actions, looking at priority actions, and then looking at recommendations that might come out of it, and broadening these to countrywide action and that share of knowledge amongst different governments. So I think what we're hoping is that coming out of this, there's actually a global network of knowledge sharing, global network of initiatives, and we have a broader understanding of what works that we can accelerate further as well. And let's go to the next one. So the secondary takeaways after the Building Breakthrough was that these are not written actually in the official agreements, but these are actually the things that I saw on the ground, and some of the focuses have shifted, for example. And some of these there was an augmented focus on the built environment. Literally every building, every pavilion that I've been to, there was mention about either building materials or the buildings around us, or the impact of climate change on the buildings, or the health and well-being of individuals in different communities as tied to buildings. And when I say that, it wasn't only about building necessarily, but it was also the things around the building, the whole built environment together, bringing in the cities, right? Bringing in the infrastructure, bringing in the landscape. So I think this shift in, moving away from buildings, but looking at a more holistic ecosystems of cities was a very welcome change that I observed. The other thing that was very interesting was, of course, the developing nations are taking incredible action, live action, and without potentially the means and methods that we might be privileged to have, and the funds we might privilege to have in the developed world. And what was interesting, while we have a great maybe way of systemizing, creating action plans and funds to action these, they actually take a very different approach often. It was about, with limited funds, limited effort, making the greatest impact in real-time actions. So the two combined, I thought it was a very interesting dynamic there. And that exchange of information amongst nations was also visible on the floor of this negotiations too, which was very fruitful, very diverse, and very interesting. Third item I observed was the gender and climate change. And I happened to be in a session where there was a heated conversation amongst a few nations. They were saying that basically gender was not included, gender parity was not included in the Paris Agreement. Therefore, some of the funding was not being equally distributed, and some of the nations were saying they could not take affirmative action on this. And one of the outcomes, I believe, is there's actually a report on this that you can also find more detail on it. Innovative technologies such as carbon removal, storage, and utilization, such as direct air capture, I believe it's here to stay, because many actually key players were talking about these potential strategies as potential technologies that could help us combat assist with the reduction of the carbon emissions globally. And then emphasis on the transparency and radical collaboration was, I think we are all realizing that while we might do great work in our little circles, in our own location, in our cities and states, there was also need for radical collaboration and transparency globally as well, was noted. And then 3 pilot programs were announced in terms of concrete, steel, and timber on how to get close to net zero on the production of these particular highly used building systems. And within this conversation here, there's of course many organizations that participated on these, and Architecture 2030 was one of them, but there was many other ones. And what I wanted to do is maybe give a brief insight on what the focus that I heard from these key organizations were. And right before that, maybe I can share my insights and predictions on how this relates to those as well. And these are not written anywhere. These are totally Yasemin's opinions and Yasemin's predictions here. But I think the carbon dioxide removal technologies are here to stay. I don't think they're going anywhere. In fact, there's actually funds increasing, and they're growing in scale and location. There is actually mention of micronuclear as a potential solution. And I'm not an expert on this, but I thought it was interesting that there was conversation about this in the event. There was a lot of discussions on diversity and climate, and how do we get to an equitable transition? And how do we shift from pure building thinking to infrastructure, landscape, and city scale thinking to amplify our impact. And then the status report this year included mention of embodied carbon and whole life carbon, which was, I believe there's a greater emphasis on it, and we're gonna see this emphasis growing further and further. And the last one, I think the transition is really painful for many, for some of us here too, but also in other locations, maybe even more painful. And I wanna maybe tell an anecdote here. In one of the other delegates that I was with actually was taking the train back to the metro back to his hotel, and he was sitting next to 2 Iraqi delegates, official delegates from Iraq. And the conversation ended up being about fossil fuels and phasing them out. And it was interesting that delegates were saying something like, "Oh my goodness, this will be really, really difficult for us. We'll be dead." I think, of course, I think this was an indication that, you know, what an important part of their life fossil fuels is. Their economy depends on it. And how do we actually enable a just transition so that those of us in this industry, but also those of us in other industries, can create an environment where there's still economic stability, there's livelihood of people are not impacted, and actually there's a well-being is protected and economics are protected. Is a key question that I think I left the event with. So with this, in this context, what about the other organizations? What were they talking about? What the focus was? So I'll briefly touch on a few here. And some of the ones that I'll talk about is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Architecture 2030, German Green Building Council, French High Performance Building Council, US Green Building Council, World Green Building Council, and Climate Heritage Network. Hopefully you're familiar with some, or this might give you an opportunity to maybe get to learn them a little bit better also. So at this event, Global ABC obviously was key part of the Buildings Breakthrough Initiative. And as part of that, they had also a great partnership with World Business Council for Sustainable Development Group as a contributor. And World Business Council for Sustainable Development has been working actually on a global initiative about how we can enable a market transformation in the building industry, and trying to actually identify what are the key levers, key actions that needs to be taken in the 3-year period to actually enable this transition. So there was a workshop when I was there, and actually there was a lot of actions that were identified, and I think they're gonna put together this market transformation agenda and action plan. I was part of the Architecture 2030 delegation and also representing SOM, and very much basically invested in nature-based infrastructure, looking at what do we know already from passive measures, building traditions that can be applied today. What about the use of existing buildings and reuse them was a key focus, and also reduce embodied carbon of building materials was areas of focus. And US Green Building Council, on the other hand, of course, was looking at priorities of the United States in the US Pavilion. But also, you know, it was great to actually see them in action talking about LEED version 5, which had just come out basically last year. And it incorporates some of the key criteria that we're talking about, such as embodied carbon, and maybe amplifying the impact that what sustainable buildings can be, should be today. So great emphasis on that. French High Performing Building Institute was actually talking about what I thought was the most interesting concept I saw at COP. It was sufficiency. So they have what they have what they call the sufficiency lab. And this lab is actually talking about basically, I think, sufficiency as a decarbonization tool. And do we have sufficient of a reason to demolish a building and build a new one? Is the building working within its means? Meaning, is it sufficient? Is the energy it's producing sufficient for its lifetime, let's say? Or is the materials used sufficient for the building, or there are extras that we can omit from them? So I thought it was a very interesting take on the word of sufficiency in the built environment. And after this, actually, I've heard a similar descriptions from others. So I think this is a word, this is a definition or an initiative that we're going to continue to hear more and more. And on the other hand, I was actually at an event with, I was presenting at a panel with the president of German Green Building Council. And their focus was actually a lot more on the passive measures and low-tech and what they call the Baufilter. Going back to maybe the traditional materials, the passive ways of doing things was a great emphasis for them. And I think the conversation around this, when in our panel was about, I think we need to all define how we relate to technological advancements and how we also use existing technologies or passive systems and define this equation in our industry, in our work every day. And then the last one that I'll mention here was the Climate Heritage Network. And this is a very interesting organization, I find, because, you know, their focus is actually on creating climate resilient futures through culture, such as from art and heritage and of different locations around the world. And I thought, what a great way actually to expand, amplify the message, but also the impact it can have. And their initiatives were also very interesting about how some of these are amplified around the globe. And during the events, then there was, I think, during COP, there was a couple of events also that talked about transparency and collaboration. And I was actually part of one of them, led by Nigel Tonks, and City of Sydney is on the right side as well here. And we were talking about how, as cities, but also as private industries, private companies, we have a benefit and a responsibility to actually promote transparency at our work and what we do, and also radical collaboration in our work to overcome some of the obstacles that we might all be facing in the industry. So this was my takeaway from COP for a minute, and I'm sure you have questions, and I would love to answer them in a minute. But maybe I want to pivot briefly here. What the future might be like for us. So I don't know if anyone has heard of, if you were in person, I would have asked for a raise of hands, but I won't do that here. I started asking sometimes, how many of us have heard of the fifth industrial revolution? And I usually get one hand or maybe none sometimes in the built environment, in the building industry, usually. And this is really shocking to me because we are actually living through through fifth industrial revolution. And I think this is an opportunity for us to actually evolve the way we work and create a better future for all of us. Yet we're not actually talking about these as much as maybe we could or should or would. So what is the fifth industrial revolution? So let's jump into it. It's one that actually specifically focuses on human-centric approaches, sustainability, and resiliency. I mean, it's almost kind of describing what we're trying to do in the built environment every day, although we're not maybe the leaders of this movement yet, and it's mostly led right now by technology companies and businesses as well. And, you know, my question was, why is this not a bigger topic in construction industry then? You know, if it's a synthesis of these three topics, that's exactly aligning with our goals here. And particularly, you know, looking at this graph from Architecture 2030, I mean, 42% of our global emissions, carbon emissions, come from buildings. It's almost half. Can you imagine? I mean, it's half. You're almost emitting half of the emissions globally. And what's kind of shocking is that, you know, we are still relying on the systems developed or materials developed during the third industrial revolution, and largely still dependent on fossil fuel economy and fossil fuel use for production. So here, I want to just look back to third industrial revolution and today in other industries and where they are, and look at the building industry too. The left side image here is an image from third industrial revolution from 70s, let's say, and the right side is what we're the current equivalent and how much it's changed. So for example, our phones that we use, obviously they're doing very different things, have evolved over time, and we are able to run our lives in our phones almost these days. In terms of cars, yes, they were reliant on fossil fuels, and today we're seeing that electric vehicles are becoming more and more used and available in many of the cities around the globe. When we look at computers, where we were versus where we are today, and how efficient, how much energy efficient, material efficient, and how their processing capabilities have increased so much over the years. And then lastly, I show a building here. So the left side is Lever House, and I'm comparing two SO1 buildings here, so that I'm comparing ours to ours. Left side is Lever House from 1950s. Right side is 7 World Trade Center, and I'm joining from this building you're seeing on the right side today on this Zoom. And if you squint your eyes, the systems that we built, the materials that we use are fairly similar in both of them. Of course, the right side building, you know, has evolved, and system use are performing better today. Therefore, it's a LEED certified building. However, if you look at it essentially, it's still the systems and materials that were invented during that time. And why is this important? Because it's our wake-up call as well. So this chart that I'm showing you here is actually from our American Institute of Architects 2030 challenge. So this challenge suggests that all the signatories should try to get their buildings to be zero energy, net zero energy by 2030. And you're seeing that we are at 53%, looking at the average of the companies who are submitting for this challenge every year. So rather than 80% we should be today, we're at 53%. And yes, we are making incremental improvements. But if we go with the current projection rate, we're gonna have a big gap that by 2030, we're not gonna achieve this goal. So that means that actually we need to take clear steps, and maybe evolution is wonderful, but we need to make bigger steps here and maybe revolutionize our industry as well. So I had outlined then 5 steps that could potentially be pushing the needle, and transition, defining our role, adopting, developing, and redefining as well. So the first one, transition, what I mean by that is transition out of fossil fuels. So we need to break away from the dependency of the built environment on fossil fuels and transition to a much more to an environment that uses renewable sources and respect the resources we have and respect planetary boundaries altogether. The second one is define how we feel about new and existing materials. And what I mean by this is there's a lot of low-tech materials, technologies that we know that already work around the globe, such as passive design strategies. But also we know that there's a lot of new technologies, such as biomaterials, robotic buildings, energy generation with new materials such as solar glass, carbon capture technologies. So how can we define what the future looks like for the built environment going forward? And I believe that this is actually, it needs to be a mix of the two, of the passive strategies such as thermal mass, microclimates, natural ventilation, but also some of the newer technologies such as robotics, new generation of materials that create better energy, and carbon capture machines that can be implemented as well. And the next slide I think is really what gets me really excited about new generation of materials. So we are seeing that today in development, there's a lot of biomaterials, nature-based materials, maybe fungi-based materials even, and the existing materials that are getting better and better with their carbon emissions, and also higher content recycling, and really rethinking the way we build things is giving me a lot of hope. And we also have a collaboration, for example, with biocement company Prometheus Materials, creating, helping to bring to market basically a microalgae alternative to concrete block. And we designed a pavilion at COP using a brick that has 95% less emissions than a traditional kilned clay brick. So some of these materials are around us, and some of them are actually in mass production and available too. So it's an opportunity for us to redefine this relationship we have up to existing, to traditional, and also to new generation materials as well. And then we must adopt the system level thinking. And this is something that we explored in our urban sequoia design on modular carbon absorbing design. And in our industry today, in our conventional construction, it's very much additive approach. So we built first the structure, we add the facade, we add the MEP systems, we add interiors, and many other things. And this also means that their carbon emissions are also additive too, not just they're physically additive on top of each other. So how can we go to a more actually integrated approach where every part does more than one function and has dual, triple duty, and we can start to eliminate some of the parts and reduce carbon emissions as well, is an idea we were exploring in this project. And then fourth, we should expand the same level of thinking beyond just buildings. And this was something that we heard at COP about, not just look at buildings, but look at cities, look at environments, look at infrastructure. And when we did this analysis on square mile study, we looked at 6 different districts, and we were trying to identify, are there carbon trends that we're seeing with related to density? So, you know, some of us might have heard the high buildings, tall buildings are bad is a general preconceived notion, although this might not be true. So what we did here is we looked at 6 different districts, and we looked at their holistic carbon emissions in terms of operational, in terms of embodied carbon, transportation, and many other parts as well. And what this showed us was that the lowest ones we see here are the mixed-use districts. And the density did not make as much of a difference. So it is not about the height of building the density, but it's more about the use. The mixed use could make a bigger impact than height. So how do we go from building thinking to district thinking is an important factor in our everyday designs, I think, towards decarbonization. And then finally, I also was talking about what is an architect, what's the role of an architect? And I believe that our role as architects are actually changing. I was at COP as not just an architect, but also an environmentalist, an activist, an advocate for our industry. And I know there are many on this call who do the same, but also who are researchers and who are academics as well, that our role is continuously evolving. And I was even asking a provocation here, you know, could we imagine actually a world where architects are not just hired to design the early stage design process only, but actually can we be stewards of buildings where we look after the building for its lifetime, such as when there's a renovation that's needing to be done, a replacement, and every step could be an improvement of carbon emissions as well. So in any case, so it's basically what basically my final takeaway here was that we have an opportunity here. There's a lot of progress being done in materials, in technology, in policy, and in also agreements from the nation. And how can we reposition our industry and make this a green renaissance for all of us? And I was also saying that maybe I hope that in 20 years' time, we can look back at this moment and say that, yes, that was a big transition moment. We got there. Because I don't want to imagine if we don't get there, what that might look like for our planet and our world as well. And I'll just finish here with basically suggesting that good design can also be low carbon. So I'll just show a few images of the pavilion that we designed at COP for one of our clients. It was using basically timber on one side and 95% reduced carbon emitting brick on the other side from Kinotech, and integrated nature too. And it was actually a gathering space for educational programs, for presentations as well. So it was really, it was an ambitious program, and it was very informative sessions that took place here. So we were very happy to bring people together, and also in this beautiful pavilion, low carbon pavilion that we created. And this was the work of not just designers, but engineers and many other disciplines actually working together to make this happen at Oman too. So that brought me to my last slide here. I'm sure that was a lot to digest here, but I wanted to make sure that, you know, we can cover many aspects of what we saw at COP and what was coming up maybe in conversation. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share here so we can. Perfect.
Well, thank you very much, Yasemin. I imagine it was a rather extraordinary challenge to try and boil down what happened in 12 days with between 95 and 100,000 people. You know what happened, and as I said earlier, I know there've been a lot of reports on this. One of the things I found out with a lot of the reports was that they overlapped in observations and conclusions, and that's fine. I'm a very big fan of redundancy, because in each category, people put more emphasis and more weight on what it's about. And even in your own presentation, I think that, what you delivered to us was directed, as your final slides suggest, to the architect, design, building industry. And there are so many other industries involved in all of this. I needn't begin to mention them, but, certainly the energy producing industry may be primary among them. And all of that related. I liked your little comment about the Iraqi, listening to that comment, and it reminded me about the context, all of the context. If there are 193 nations in the United Nations, then there are for sure 193 contexts in which all of what we're discussing has to be unpacked and dealt with. And within those contexts, there's not necessarily one culture, but multiple cultures. And within each one of those, there's an economy or the means of money, some of which I hope we'll discuss in the next few minutes. There have been some very nice comments made. Some are more comments in the chat, some are more questions, and I encourage people actually to visit the chat for that purpose and see, because we have people responding to other people's questions, which is probably in a Zoom format as good as it gets, because there's some structure. But there are some questions, and there was one asked early on, which I'd like to just tick off because it's really a tick off question. It's been responded to. But the first question was, has the use of fossil fuels actually been decreasing recently? And was this addressed? Of course, it was the topic of the whole COP. But in the big picture of things, and Sulan, one of our colleagues, has responded that not likely in the near future, but hopefully in the long future. But since you listened to the biggest conversation available, what can we say about that as being, the biggest elephant in our room is the role of fossil fuels. Yeah, there's a whole load of other elements, but boiling it down, whether it's carbon or methane or whatever, do we see a reduction in the employ of the most deleterious materials? And what do we do with that information?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pretend to be an expert in the, or a researcher on the whole global use of fossil fuels. And, I have limited knowledge on obviously some of the other sectors, and that this question is very much dependent on which area, which country, and which sector we're talking about, for example. So if you look at US, for example, we are seeing that actually with the use of electric vehicles and the increase of renewable electricity coming into the stations, the emissions of the in transportation, we're seeing incremental reductions on it, for example. In the building sector, we're seeing some reduction. Although I'm not an expert in a sector that I'm not as familiar with, but I think Solange's response is correct in the sense that I think what was important about this, it's not where we are today. I think it's the importance of this COP was that it was the first time all these nations, not anecdotally, in a written document, they have agreed that there was a need to phase out fossil fuels. And there was a need to actually lower their carbon emissions in the interim as well. So not just looking at the end goal, but the middle too. And I think that's a historical moment. So as a result, I think we're going to see in the near future, we're going to start seeing reductions in many of the largest emitting countries, I think. And also the reduction of subsidies, etc., is a very important tool that governments can use for this as well. And it was one of those moments where actually the nations, I think, realized that, look, we are probably, sad to say it, but we are probably the last generation who can make a significant impact here to actually maintain a world similar to the way we have it today. It won't be the same, but similar, hopefully, not too bad. So I think this idea that remaining under the 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, and trying to do that not by 2050 but 2040, even though that's not written yet. I think that's where we're moving towards, and I suspect we're going to see bigger and bigger reductions going forward as well.
You know, it's very interesting. I was thinking there's the academic research, there's the professional project work, and then there's the experiential observed world that we all inhabit. And I was thinking, oh, it must be maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I had the opportunity of going to Mongolia and spending some time in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, the coldest capital city in the world. And finding, even though I thought I'm going to a place on the top of the world, the air will be clear, the technology will be low. Well, the technology was certainly very low. But in the city of Ulaanbaatar, it was the most polluted city on earth. A city of 2 stories high, mostly, the most polluted city on earth, because everyone in Ulaanbaatar for heat and cooking burnt coal. And it has gone from the most polluted to no longer the most polluted because of a minor change in technology, delivering new means of heating and cooking to this relatively low density but tightly packed city. And it encourages me that individually in contexts around the world, there's what we do. Today, I read an article on the first all-electric office building in New York City. There are points of light. How to digest them and synthesize them, I think, we're going to see over time. So that's just an observation on what I think, again, in the chat. If people visit it, you will find actually references to fossil fuel use, consumption, and reduction or not. And I advise you to grab those links. There was another question that came, which I think is such a good one. I'll share it, but I'm not really sure that it's directly related to what we're discussing, but it's all interrelated. And it was really the question of sea level rise and well, how that intersects with everything we're doing. And this is not, again, to put you, Yasemin, on the spot. If I was going to put anyone on the spot, it would be Klaus Jacob, who's on the call, who is a hero of mine. But did sea level rise as a component of, a climate challenge? Was it on the table at all? Was it addressed? If so, can you say a sentence or two about it? I think it's one of the more dynamic. When I refer to Klaus, easily 15 years ago, and I think I will say it very much at my prodding, said that we were underestimating the consequences of sea level rise. And I think we all know the consequences now to be true, and we're trying to do things. But was there commentary on that and its interrelationship with the main events?
I actually attended a session on a particular session that touched on this topic, and there was mention, of course, and I think, of course, this is a critical impact of climate change, but the focus was not just in the sea level changes either. I think the conversation maybe is now shifting around, sea level rise, of course, and this and this and this. So there was a much more, I found there was a much more holistic conversation about all the impacts of climate change. So I felt that generally our understanding of it, the impacts of it, is much broader. Not only physical impacts were mentioned, such as sea level rise, but also economic, cultural, and social impacts, and health impacts were also mentioned. So it felt to me that we were moving away from we're maturing from talking about the physical impacts into actually being able to talk to how these impacts are challenging people's social situations, communities, livelihood, food chains, and others. And I find that was actually a very welcome conversation that took this from the abstract and actually related it directly into communities and how we live our lives. which I thought was a very productive way to talk about it. So it's not a concept in the abstract, but actually now we're talking about what science says, what experts say about how our lives are changing as a result.
There are three more areas I'd like to delve into. Time will fly by quickly, so I'm going to try and touch on them and see if I give them all to you together and see if we can weave things together. But one of the comments, and again, this is directly from Klaus Jacob, the compensation fund, the 700 billion available, or that which was assigned to the loss and damage. The question was, are there targets for how much the US and other developed countries are willing to put into the fund? And I know this is, again, not an area that you might be totally expert in, but I too felt when reading all the reports and catching the live comments, the live sessions I could, that while the amounts sounded enormous to me that were being put in, but then again, I'm fairly old, so those amounts are probably not enormous, really. Compared to the need, and I don't know if there's, I know there are comments on the need. I'm particularly focused on the loss and damage fund, in part because I've run into people from small island states, and I've heard their lament, or if you like, their panic over their reality. And I mean that in a most heartfelt way. Where are we with the money? In a big picture, did you leave feeling that funds in the various categories would be sufficient going forward to respond to the need?
There are probably others who can respond to that much better in the audience here, economists, etc. But I think the countries do have commitments that they made. Not every country, but many of the nations, such as US, have declared their commitments to the fund and the duration that they're willing to do so. So I think there's definition on it in terms of how much would nations contribute, what is the timeline for those contributions. So I think these are facts. Now, the interesting thing is, like, if you think of global economies around the world and how many of us there are around the world, clearly $700 million is not going to cover everything that we're seeing around the globe. But this is also the beginning, right? That was another moment when that was agreed in the previous year's loss and damage fund, because it was the first time nations agreed that actually there was a need for this, because the impacts were felt unequitably in different places. When we were looking at, I don't know, Pacific Islands, for example, where, this is their home, this is their livelihood, versus when we look at where we are, where I am in New York today, we are talking about different levels of impact here, and also different levels of investments as well. So I see it as a positive step. Is 700 million. I'm not an economist again, but I'm pretty sure that it's not enough to cover everything.
He said billion, but
billion, yeah. So
I'd like to yes, but I want to introduce and segue quickly, because I've been very, very, I hopefully generous trying to cover the questions that people have posted, but I have one of my own which I'd like to take a quick look at, because I think it is in your wheelhouse. Energy, the biggest issue being energy. I am still concerned about the role and the application of nuclear energy in all of its developing formats, micro or means of production. I know that in this country, from certainly conversations and information I have had, in this country, we are psychologically opposed to nuclear energy. We've been trying to divest ourselves of it and try to expiate our guilt over having used so much of it in the Second World War. But I'm wondering, did you leave Dubai thinking that the big seesaw of fossil versus whatever else it could be, and the constant graphs I see that say renewables are great, they can cover a lot, but they can't close the gap And I'm always concerned about that closing the gap as being the greatest challenge. Did you leave with a sense that that nuclear energy might be a contender to helping close that gap?
I did not, because I was exposed to very limited conversations on nuclear, to be honest. I think it was only mentioned in one of the sessions that I attended, and that was at a very high level, and it was not giving details on the particular systems, particular advancements, and so it was hard for me to see how effective or ineffective or safe or unsafe these could be. But I think many of us probably share similar concerns that, as we call renewable energies, often, using the natural um, resources of the world, which have very high impact and very high safety as well figures. Meanwhile, when we talk about nuclear energy, and I grew up in a part of the world that was impacted by the Chernobyl catastrophe back in the day, um, obviously, it's nuclear energy seems to be a safe option until it's really not safe. Meanwhile, other options we're looking at, such as renewable energy creation, they're safe, and when they're not safe, they're still safe, often much safer. So I think that's the kind of the maybe concerns that many of us probably are thinking in our heads, and maybe trying to create our own point of views. But also, I think that gap that you're identifying is in many people's thinking right now. How do we advance the creation of renewables? How do we reduce the demand, and trying to kind of bring them closer together? And then what else we can do for that gap that we are seeing in the immediate term, to mitigate. And for that, some people are looking at carbon capturing, for example. Others are looking at micro nuclear, etc. So I think there's multiple technologies that are being considered today. But again, I do believe that the safest things we can do right now is reduction, and augmenting the technologies that we know work in our environment to try to get there before 2040, hopefully.
So that's a wonderful way to end, and maybe give me an opportunity to share with the very many attendees. And I don't want to forget to thank all of you for not just the questions, but the comments. There's a lot of excellent comments. I don't know whether or not we have the capacity to save these. And if we do, I hope they can be as I speak. But, from Janice and Sulan and Pam, everyone has there are very many good comments. Jumping off from your last comment, I would also like to share that the CSU, I don't know, I guess I could call this the year of carbon. We're going to have a flagship program at the United Nations. We're going to do an Urban Thinkers Campus. We are devoted to this very much, with the leadership of Yasemin and others who are central to CSU policy and programs. So for all of you interested in this, please stay with us. We will continue with the Green Cities program, of course, and we'll continue hopefully to visit cities around the world that are undertaking best practices, and they surface from time to time, from Curitiba to Tallinn. Stay with us on that. Be aware of the fact that we are able to do these wonderful programs by raising some funds, which we will do at this year's gala in March. I think you'll all receive information about that. So I would like to thank everyone who attended. And of course, I'd like to thank mostly Yasemin for taking the time and the energy and the commitment to boil down her visit for us to all understand the crux of what happened in Dubai. Thank you, Yasemin.
Of course, it's my pleasure. And clearly, there's so many great questions in the audience here, and so many great comments. And I appreciate also the information that's being shared too. So wonderful conversation. Thank you.